Now that I'm back in the United States, one of the first things that I wanted to do was get my library card reactivated and start checking out books again. One of the interesting things about living abroad for a number of years is that each time you come back, you notice things have changed, and that's true about libraries as well. The first time I came back to the United States after having lived abroad for a number of years was in 2006. And that was the first time that I noticed that libraries were stocking comic books as part of the books you could check out, which was not true in my youth, at least not at my local library. I don't know if your local library was different, but my reading experience would have been a lot different if my local library had carried comic books when I was a kid. One of the reasons I got into comic books so late, it was about 15 before I started seriously collecting comics, is I just didn't have any access to them as a kid. We lived out in the boondocks, out in the suburbs. There was no comic book stores near where I lived. My mother didn't approve of them, etc. Anyways, I'm rambling. Point being, when I was back in the U.S. in 2006, I was surprised, but pleasantly surprised, to see that there are all these graphic novels now in the library that you could just check out. And come to think of it, perhaps the reason that these hadn't been around in my youth is because graphic novels hadn't been as much of a thing back then, right? I mean, there were comics on the newsstand, but the collected editions that were sold in bookstores and in libraries, those weren't as much of a thing when I was younger. So that was probably part of it as well. Anyways, now that I'm back now, I was going to the library expecting to see the graphic novel section just as I left it in 2006, but instead find that it's stocked full of titles I don't recognize. And so this is one of the dangers of being out of touch for the last 20 years. I didn't recognize any of the titles. I mean, obviously I knew who the Avengers were, but because I haven't been reading current comic books for the last 25 years, I had no idea what the No Surrender series was. And all of the comics I remembered from my youth, those graphic novels were no longer on the shelves. The comics from the 80s and 90s, I guess you have to special order them from interlibrary alone. All the stuff that was on the shelf was more recent comic book collections. So I decided, what the heck, let's jump into it and see if I can get into some of the more recent comics. Now, the danger with jumping in is comic books always have a fair amount of continuity that you have to keep up with. And if you've been not reading comic books for the past 25 years, it can be a little bit daunting to catch up on the continuity. On the other hand, that can also be part of the fun as well. And this is what I remember from when I first got into comic books around 15, is that there were years of continuity that you didn't know about, but gradually putting the pieces together and figuring out what the character stories and what the backstory was and putting all the puzzle pieces together was part of the fun. So that's the way I approached it this time as well. As we pick up, there are multiple different Avenger squads, I guess. There's the Avengers, there's Unity Squad, there's US Avengers, and then there's unaffiliated. Actually, sorry, let me back up slightly. I'm getting ahead of myself. This volume is Avengers No Surrender. According to the publisher's information here and also Wikipedia, it was published in 2018. It's a series of 16 issues collected here in one volume. I didn't know this when I first picked it up, but according to the research I did on the internet and Wikipedia, this was one of the big Avengers events of the last 10 years. I guess maybe the biggest event in the last 10 years. It says here on the cover, this book justifies the use of the word epic. And I go along with that. It is a pretty epic event. Okay, so here we are. 2018, the Avengers. There are different squads here. I recognize, of course, a lot of these names. So, Quicksilver, Human Torch, Beast, I know him. Some of these I do not know, but actually, as you read through it, it does become more clear. So when you first look at this, you're like, oh, I'm never going to be able to keep this straight. And the first few pages are pretty confusing, figuring out who are these people. I should also add as a side note, I was never really big into Marvel to begin with, even during the era where I was comic book collecting in the early 90s, I was doing more DC. So I've got all that against me trying to get into this. But as you go through, it does get easier, and you do sort out the characters. And at the end of each issue, there's a little spotlight on one of the Avenger teams where it goes through and gives the characters a brief timeline of where we are in the continuity. And so reading this as you go along does help you to keep it all straight. Now, if you've been watching this channel, you know that the past year, when I've been reviewing comic books, they've been mostly old comic books. So some of the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby reprints from the 1960s, or the Thor from the 1970s, or the Incredible Hulk from the 1980s. And as someone who's been reading a lot of old comic books recently, and then transitions to the 2018 comic book, it is just so noticeable, the difference in pacing. And how much more action-packed these panels are. So much is happening. Within the first few panels, before we even get halfway through the first issue, the Earth has been stolen, just disappears. And then there's some sort of cataclysm happening on Earth. And I think to myself, if this was back in the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era, we would have had like a whole issue just explaining how Earth got lost with, the lots of text in those text boxes, and all the characters would be narrating their thoughts with everything they did, like, I am running now, have to run faster, now I'm pushing now, which was how the characters' dialogues was always like that in the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era. But the way that the dialogue and text is a lot less, and so much more is conveyed by the visuals and just the very fast pace at which all this moves is, I guess that's the difference between old comics and new comics, huh? It's a pace that is, I find, somewhat exhausting. These characters really do not get a lot of room to breathe on this epic adventure. They're just constantly going from one battle to another. Now, I don't know if that's always what comics are like nowadays, or if that's just because this was a big event. Really, the only time things slows down, spoiler, is the very last issue. And then here, finally, we have some characters just sitting around talking to each other. But up until then, it's just constant motion. So anyways, there's the Earth is stolen, disappears. It's vanished away to some phantom realm. And there are all these cataclysms that go on. And then two teams, a few things happen. First of all, a bunch of prominent heroes just get frozen. So a bunch of the prominent heroes are out of commission. And then two teams show up to fight each other. And we're shown here the Black Order and the Lethal Legion. According to the notes at the end of this issue, a lot of the Lethal Legion characters are brand new characters, whereas the Black Order characters have some deeper history. They were, I guess, formerly Thanos' team. But they arrive and then immediately start fighting each other. And of course, here's not where the confusion comes in. You're like, wait, who's on which team again? Why are they fighting each other? And I was, those panels, I was going back here to figure out, okay, who's on which team again? What's going on? So there is that confusion when these two new teams do show up out of nowhere, but it does quickly become manageable again. So speaking of new characters, I think comics have gotten more diverse since I was reading comics. And again, this is something I remember I've been vaguely familiar with because I've seen a lot of other YouTubers complain about it. So, for example, Iron Man is no longer a white male, Tony Stark. It's now Tony Ho, who's got, I guess, the Iron Man mantle, even though she's no longer in the suit. So it's she's female, she's ethnic, she's Vietnamese, she's lesbian, and she's got the pink hair. So, you know, this is just like a checklist of things that people love to complain about with comic books being too woke and stuff like that. And there's a fair amount of this with the other characters as well. And I find, I don't like to take sides here, but I find it did not spoil the story for me at all that Iron Man was now an ethnic lesbian woman instead of a straight white man. I mean, I think either way wouldn't have bothered me much. I wouldn't have spoiled the story for me if he was a straight white man either. But at least in terms of this collection, and keep in mind this is the only collection I've read of Marvel Comics for the past 25 years, didn't spoil the story for me at all. Anyways, the plot is that Earth is put onto some phantom zone. There are all these natural disasters going around that the Avengers have to try and put out. And then two supercharged villain teams, the Black Order and the Lethal Legion, arrive and start fighting each other on Earth. And as it develops, Earth has been chosen as a place to play the game of the contest between the Black Order and the Lethal Legion. And the Avengers are caught in the middle. So there's a lot going on. There's also a few clever mysteries which are teased out rather well. So we have here Voyager, one of the classic Avengers, or so everyone says. And what I thought was a little bit clever, when they're talking about Voyager, they reproduce all these classic Avenger covers or iconic scenes and have Voyager put into them. Recreating the original feel of the original artwork, etc. But of course, if you know anything about comics, and you don't even have to be a super fan, you can be a casual fan like I am, you know that Voyager was not part of the original Avengers team. So even for somebody like the casual fan like me, this is a huge red flag that this character is not who everyone thinks she is, and there's either some sort of weird retcon going on, or they're in some sort of alternate universe, or something, because this character doesn't belong in all those classic Avenger stories. So figuring out who Voyager is and why everyone remembers her as one of the founding members of the Avengers is one of the little teaser mysteries that gets drawn out throughout this book, and one of the hooks that keeps you reading. So the first few issues, once it's established that there's this huge game going on between the Grandmaster and the Challenger, is that the two different teams are fighting, and the Avengers throw themselves into the middle of the battle. Now, I may have missed something, but there are at least a few battles early on where it's not clear to me why the Avengers threw themselves into the middle of it. So you've got two bad guy teams who are fighting each other. And there are cases where you would think the Avengers would just want to sit back and watch the bad guys fight each other, when instead they jump in and get in the middle of the fight themselves, just creating more chaos. To be fair, though, as the story does progress, the Avengers are given a reason why they want to stop this contest from happening, because it's established that once the contest is over, Earth is just going to be discarded and destroyed. Or they're using Earth as a playing field. And then once the playing field is no longer needed, then it'll just be destroyed. So that's the reason that the Avengers would have to try and stop this contest from going on. As I go through here, I guess I'm just going to spoil most of the story. We get a lot of battle scenes, like I said. The story is non-stop action. We do get a backstory for who the Challenger is here and why he wants to challenge the Grandmaster, which is interesting. Oh yeah, Thor is now a woman, Lady Thor. Again, did not spoil the story for me. These are some more panels where it's not clear why the Avengers are throwing themselves into the middle of this fight at this stage. But, okay. Then, yeah, eventually the Hulk gets resurrected. Now, I guess in this point in continuity, the Hulk had been away for a while. I don't know how long. But then once he comes back, he is unstoppable. And I think, again, I don't know Marvel Comics as well as I perhaps should. But I think the Hulk's strength level has varied throughout the years, right? He started off just kind of strong, but not like completely unstoppable strong. But then over the years, he got more and more powerful, right? Because in this, he is just portrayed as unstoppable. Like all the Avengers tried to stop him. He is stronger than any of them, all of them together. He just pounds through all of them. And there's this epic fight against the Hulk. And it is really a big, epic fight. Of course, by the time you get to this issue, if you're reading them all in one sitting, you're kind of already a little bit glazed over because there have been so many big, epic fights before we get here. But it is interesting. Again, after each issue, there's a little behind the scenes that the writers and the creators talk about the process of writing this. And they talk about how they had mapped out the whole Hulk fight before actually drawing it and deciding, okay, which Avengers are going to be in which room and how is the Hulk going to go through these rooms. So it is interesting. I mean, they're quite proud of themselves, and that comes through very clearly here when they're talking about how much work they spent laying this out. And then they bring it up again a little bit later. where is it? They're bringing up again here, talking about their favorite moments, about how much work it took to map out that whole thing with the Hulk fight. And so that was interesting to see that behind the scenes part of it a little bit. Because, when you're reading it, to a certain extent, to a large extent, you're not really thinking about how much work the creators had to go through to keep to have the spatial dynamics of this fight make sense. I'm not sure how much would have really changed if they hadn't mapped it out in such detail, if it had just been a series of fights with the Hulk. But it was interesting that they had mapped that out in such detail so that the Hulk does go through these rooms and fights different people at different places, and that even though when you're reading this it's just a series of panels, there is a much larger map that the creators had of how this whole fight was playing out. It was just a little interesting behind the scenes detail, I thought. And then another big fight at the end, and more cataclysmic stuff at the end, and a lot of heroes who you think are dead, but then it turns out that they weren't really dead. They were just, trapped in stasis or something during that time. And then finally, in the last issue, characters have some room to breathe, and they do some talking and wrapping up loose ends and stuff like that. So, all in all, like I said, a lot of action in this, somewhat exhausting to read through at times because the characters just almost rarely get time to breathe, almost never get time to breathe, as they're just rushing from one chaotic fight to another. But at the same time, you're never bored. As a reader, you might be a little bit exhausted at times, but you're never bored. There's a few interesting hooks and mysteries to keep you turning the pages, even though the basic plot is just, a big battle between different teams. I certainly found it readable. So if you're looking for something interesting to read, you could do a lot worse than to pick this up. It's quite readable. And that is Avengers No Surrender.